Imagine being sent to jail in India. Forged documents. Iranian drug dealer? How the hell do you cross an international border without being caught? How does all this relate to a musician backpacking through the Himalayas? Stick around because it makes one hell of a good story. Hey guys, welcome to Bent Planet, where I tell you true stories of humans in abnormal predicaments. Tales that will twist your mind. And this story is no exception. If you love listening to bizarre true stories, I have a stack lined up, so please subscribe and hit the like button if you're enjoying them. It makes a huge difference in growing this community of story lovers, and I'm a one-man team, so any help is appreciated. That's enough of that, mate. Let's get on with the story. All right, get comfortable. Are you ready to hear a story? In the early 2000s, backpacking around India was a completely different level of adventure. Without today's mobile phone tech, travelers relied on paper maps, books, and word of mouth to navigate not only the land, but also the rules and regulations of the country. Gio was 25 years old and a free spirit. As a musician, he loved to collect instruments as he explored the world, and he was a regular visitor to India. Being an Italian, he was incredibly expressive and always attracted other travelers with a similar love for music and discovering the world. In 2004, while in India, he became close with a mixed group of fellow backpackers from France, Italy, Australia, and England. Songwriters, circus performers, free thinkers, they were all drawn to each other and began traveling across the country as a tight-knit team. One night, after a fun session of fire dancing, djembe drum jams, and chai tea, they got onto a discussion about their various visas, and Gio realized he had an issue. Usually, when Gio left for India, he would fly out of Italy from the city of Milan and automatically receive a 6-month tourist visa. And this is what the rest of the crew had all been given, 6 months. But on this occasion, he'd flown out of Rome, and when he checked his passport, he realized he'd been given a much shorter visa time of only 3 months. Gio was devastated. He was already reaching 3 months into his journey, and this would mean ending it, trekking into a major city area and waiting out an unpredictable amount of time for a new visa to be processed, if it was even approved. His new travel buddies didn't want to be held up, so this would mean breaking away from the pack. So he's sitting there, feeling frustrated, thinking about the mission he has to go on, and while he's looking down at his passport and the visa expiry date in his hands, he suddenly has an idea. The visa stamp is an official immigration seal, but the date of expiry is written inside it with a ballpoint pen. And the date of expiry is May, represented by the number 5. If he could add a line with a pen using the same coloured ink, he could turn that 5 into an 8 for August, and immediately turn his 3-month visa into a 6-month visa. Sheer brilliance. He runs the idea past his newfound friends, and not wanting to lose him, they all back up his bright idea. Of course he should change the number. Who's going to check properly anyway? Immigration will probably just glance at it, not think twice before stamping his exit permit when he goes to leave. Boom. Easy. So in a moment of spontaneous excitement, he takes a pen and changes the 5 into an 8. The crew then continued on with their travels, and for the next month or so, they explored the Himalayas and various parts of India, even appearing on the front page of a newspaper performing one of their music jams outside a temple. They then decided to make their way to the biggest spiritual festival in the world, Kumbh Mela, where over 100 million people gather to celebrate their communal beliefs together. Yes, I said that correctly. Over 100 million people. It was an intense experience. And after spending a number of days there, getting lost within huge crowds and drawing lots of attention as foreigners, most of the crew felt that they needed to head off on their own for some much needed personal space. Gio, too, decided to continue on solo. So suddenly he found himself travelling alone for the first time since altering his visa date. And for the first time, he felt a tiny niggling voice inside him saying, you did the wrong thing. But mostly, still feeling confident, telling himself that it would be okay, he kept traveling, meeting more amazing people, experiencing more of India, until finally D-Day began dawning and he knew he had to face the inevitable moment. It was time to organise a flight out of India. It was coming into August and even the 6-month version of his visa was coming to an end. So Gio makes his way to the city of Delhi, where he plans to book everything and leave from the international airport there. When he arrives, he checks into a cheap hotel, heads to a bar, grabs a beer, and strikes up some conversation with a Japanese man who has lived in Delhi for a number of years. Gio becomes comfortable with him, and considering this guy's understanding of the local scene, he decides to tell him the story of his visa fraud. Gio still has that little voice inside telling him he had made a silly mistake, so he's hoping that this guy will laugh off any fears and tell him that people change their visa dates all the time and there's nothing to worry about. But as Gio explains what he's done, the guy freaks out. His face goes white and he tells Gio, this is a major issue. Doctoring a visa is a huge crime in India. The punishment is serious jail time. They'll spot it the moment they scan your passport through the system. He puts his hand on Gio's shoulder and says, you're in a shitload of trouble, dude. Gio's stomach falls through the floor, and with reality punching him in the face, he knows he's made a huge mistake. Indian jails are renowned for being absolutely brutal. Gio had met people on his travels who had experienced jail time in India, and they had serious mental, if not physical, scars. Quietly, he looks at his new advisor and asks, so, any suggestions? The Japanese guy likes Gio, so he offers to help him out. The first thing he does is take him to an old Indian hotel owner that he trusts and knows is well connected with immigration people and Indian law. But again, it's not the response Gio is hoping for. This guy tells him, look, you will go to jail. The best option for you is to visit your consulate and confess. Hopefully they can formulate a plan for the least amount of punishment. Gio is petrified of telling the authorities, and he says to his Japanese friend, man, there's got to be another way. So the guy sighs and then tells him, look, I know an Iranian guy who is right in with the city mafia. He's got connections to forge passports and visas, and it's probably your only hope. So a meeting is arranged, and before long, Gio is following directions through the heavily populated streets of Delhi, pressing through crowds and the smell of incense, food, and cow shit. He turns down an alley, pushes open an old door into a dark and musty room where the Iranian is waiting for him. The stranger listens to his story and then tells him that there's only one way to fix this. For the cost of $800, he will send Gio's passport away to a professional forging expert and have the original visa restored to match what is in the immigration computer logs, the original 3-month visa. Plus, he will organize a doctor to write a letter saying that Gio has been incredibly sick and in his care, causing him to overstay his visa. As they're talking, someone unexpectedly comes out of the bathroom completely covered in sweat and looking as though they're whacked out on drugs, and Gio gets a wave of concern about who he's dealing with. The Iranian then suggests that they walk together to a nearby place where Gio can get a passport photo taken for the new visa. As they push their way along the crowded streets, they keep being interrupted by kids running up to the Iranian, and Gio notices he's giving them all tiny plastic bags that contain powder in them. At one point they stop and the Iranian excuses himself as he steps into a side alley, lifts some of the powder up to his nose and snorts it. From the noticeable effects, Gio realizes he's about to hand the last of his travel money plus his passport over to a heroin-using drug dealer he's never met before in a foreign city as a safety measure. He's already made one stupid mistake, so he decides to not make another. He's panicking inside though. Anxiety is at an all-time high. Who could possibly help him now? Unable to sit around bathing in this amount of stress, Gio heads to a travel agent and he asks them to book him a bus ride to the smallest checkpoint possible, crossing from India into Nepal. Anywhere they can think of that would be the most remote border crossing. Despite the suspicious request, they sell him a ticket for a few $100s to what they say is the best option. He grabs the ticket and leaves, and of course runs into the Iranian again, and without wanting to cause a scene, tells him that he's decided to risk a border crossing, showing him that he's already bought the ticket. The Iranian nods quietly and says, look, no worries if you don't want my service. I just ask that you forget my face. But something else you should know, this checkpoint you are going to, it is no good. I know people who have tried to cross there for similar reasons. they're in jail now. They check everyone there through the national computer system. But I know a much better place. A tiny little border town with a small checkpoint. It's your best option. Gio is faced with a choice. Does he trust this guy? Is he just trying to screw him over because he chose to not use his services? He heads back to the travel agent to ask about this town, and they tell him that yes, it's a smaller town and a less traveled border crossing, but there is no public transport to get there and he cannot get a refund on his bus ticket. God damn it. Screw it. He cannot wait for another second with this much stress boiling in his bloodstream. If he eats one more curry with this sense of doom in his stomach, he's likely to throw up for the next year. So he finds a taxi driver and, despite the expense, locks in a price, throws all his bags and instruments in the back and begins a 6-hour road trip to the border. By the time they pull into the town, it's well into the night, and as the driver navigates his way to where the border crossing is, they notice a huge amount of armed militants wandering around. The driver stops and says, "Sorry, I'm just going to drop you here. I don't feel safe." As it turns out, there's been a huge amount of conflict on the border between India and Nepal, and scores of people were being killed as Maoist insurgents bombed border areas and Indian soldiers killed Maoists. The worst time to be casually crossing the border by yourself at night. Nonetheless, with no options left, Gio loads himself up with his bags of luggage, djembe drums, singing bowls, even a didgeridoo, and with his mind scattered into a tired mess, he drags his feet in the direction the driver had pointed, towards a thin bridge leading over a river to where the checkpoint lay. As he nears the bridge, two soldiers with machine guns step out of the shadows, stopping him. Gio explains he needs to cross the border, but they tell him he's crazy. It's too late at night, people are being killed, and he needs to come back another time. But Gio refuses to back down. He has zero options. It's cross the border or collapse exhausted at the feet of these soldiers. Shaking their heads, they eventually step aside and watch as he nervously makes his way onto the bridge. A skinny, distressed looking swing bridge stretching for hundreds of meters over a river. The night is super dark and he can barely hear the water far below as the wind rocks the bridge, swaying under his weight. In the distance, he can see a lamppost lighting up the checkpoint office, and he can just make out a shadow that he presumes is an officer. His hands slipping with sweat, gripping the didgeridoo, ready to use it as a weapon if anyone decided to sneak up behind him. Every step was torture, his legs like sandbags, dragging closer and closer until finally he comes within meters of the clumsy looking outpost. Close enough that the officer inside notices him and steps out to see who is crazy enough to cross at this time of night. Gio tried to look past him and into the window of the checkpoint, desperate to know if they had a computer on that would scan his passport. He nervously stepped closer until he had almost reached the officer, and then snap. Darkness. At that exact moment, literally seconds before stepping into the light of the checkpoint, a power failure blacked out the electricity and he was left standing in the dark with the officer, who asks him, "What are you doing here?" The excitement of knowing that there was no power to operate a computer system hit Gio's body and shot endorphins up to his face with a huge smile. "I need to cross the border, please." The officer gave a brief attempt at warning Gio off, given the time, lack of power, and dangerous conflict in the area, but Gio wouldn't have it. He said that friends were waiting for him on the other side and his visa was almost expired. He had to cross now. The officer sighed and asked for Gio's passport while reaching for a small torch, but it barely flicked on as though it was almost drained. He squinted his eyes as he flicked through to find the visa and struggled to read the details, eventually looking back up at Gio and asking him if he knew the dates written on the visa. Gio could not have been happier to tell him, proudly exclaiming the dates of a 6-month visa that he was clearly abiding by. The officer smiled, stamped his exit permit, and wished him a safe and happy journey ahead. Gio felt like wings had sprung from his shoulder blades and he practically flew over the border into Nepal. Years later, Gio ended up marrying one of the women in that crew of travel buddies, and they are still happily together to this day with 2 amazing kids. So it was all very much worth it. Okay, that's a wrap on today's Twisted Tale. If you'd like to hear more true stories, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you get the next release update. Also, hit that like button to let Gio know you appreciate his story. If you would also like to hear him tell the story himself, I've released the full interview with him. The link is in the description below. Alright guys, that's it from Bent Planet. Until next time, stay bent.